Welcome, everybody. My name is Charity Rouse. I am the Director of Local History for the Spartanburg County Public Library System. And today we will be doing a hybrid program, both on Zoom and in person, for genealogy basics. I do ask that you hold your questions to the end so that we can be fair to everybody, and your question might get answered just a little bit after you had the thoughts. So it will just help us stay on topic to go through the program first. But today we will be talking about genealogy basics, getting started, some tools, some concepts of what you need to be thinking about, and information you may have at home that you need to gather. So let's jump on in. So the thing you need to do in genealogy is you're starting with a question. So what brings you to a genealogy search? Do you want to know who a specific grandparent was, or what your great-grandparent did, or do you have any Revolutionary War patriots? Those are the types of questions that bring people to genealogy. That question is your goal. So if you're looking for a Revolutionary War patriot, you're not going to be looking at immigration records for someone who came into the United States in the 1880s. You're going to be looking for a line of your family that came into the United States pre-Revolutionary War era in the 1770s and 80s. So focus your question and see what you're really interested in. Some people come to this because they want medical history. Why did each of my ancestors die? Can I figure this out? So everybody's search starts from a little bit different perspective, but the tools we use, the tips and tricks, are the same because you need to be able to answer the question with the resources. So, what is your question? Who am I? Is this family story true? Was there an Indian princess? Huge hint, no, there wasn't. Because Indians don't have princesses, Europeans do. Where did my immigrant ancestor come from? Do I have a Revolutionary War patriot? What does my DNA tell me? Can I join a lineage society? The Indian princess. How long has my family lived in this area? Who were my enslaved ancestors? Who were their owners? How can I find information about whatever the question is, military or etc.? So, genealogy is the study of family history, and it is answering these questions. It is figuring out the information and the sources to tell you what you're looking for. So, no matter what your question is, start with yourself. You practice things on people you know, and then you apply what you've learned to the next generations. So, around your house, you should have your own documentation. If you don't, you need to order it because you will need it for some purpose if you haven't already. But record the information, birth date, location, the names of your parents, if known. Where have you lived? If you're married, divorced, married, whatever. The fun stuff. Where did you attend school? Anything that would be important, and places that you may have records that you might want to get a hold of. List your children if you have children. And yes, the photos in this are usually taken by my mother, unless she is in the photo, and I have permission to share, and that is me playing with the bubbles. So, any living people that I have in this presentation, I have their permission to share about them. So, my parents were going to a fancy dress ball. A neighbor of ours ran a dance class series at James Madison University, and they took the whichever period they're dressed for ball semester how to dance. But you move back one generation at a time. Start with one parent, fill in their information, birth location, parents' names, marriage, divorce, death, whatever. And then the other parent. Obviously, if someone is living, they will not have all of these documents. And as you are adding those pieces of information, make sure you have a copy of those documents, because an unsourced, undocumented fact is just a story. It's a piece of fiction until you can say, this is when this happened. Now, if you are working with an adoption, you are going to fill in as much of the information as you can, knowing that we hope through the research process you will get more information that will change that. If you are adopted, you may want to gather the information about your adoptive family to practice, and that will help you learn what types of things you need to look for your biological family. And it's okay to research your adoptive family. That's fine. That's just not usually the question adoptees have. Adoptees really do want to know, who am I? Where did I come from? Move back one more generation. These are my grandparents, my father's parents on the top, my mother's parents more recently on the bottom. And again, work through it one person at a time. Potentially even just concentrate on one line of the family. So if I was interested in my paternal grandfather's line of the family, I would just keep looking at those Rouse marriages and relations going back. It's one of my brick wall lines. I go to my third great grandfather. I have a probable mother, but I don't know who his daddy was. And other than he most likely died young and she remarried. But it is helpful as you are writing these things down. You don't have to research the brothers and sisters, but it is helpful to write their names down, because even with what seems to be an unusual surname, you may very well have multiple people with the same name, born in the same county, in the same year. My mother, for instance, is Mary Jane Lawhorn, born June 6, 1943, and in Rockbridge County, Virginia, there was also a Mary Jane Lawhorn, different family, still have not been able to connect the two. They're at least third or fourth cousins. And she was born January 21st, 1943, Rockbridge County, Virginia. It's not a big, really high population county. Two, there's a third Mary Jane Lawhorn born in neighboring Nelson County 2 years before them. So just because you think it's a unique name doesn't mean it is. So do some due diligence as you move back and forth through your generations, just to make sure you are researching the right family, because you can spend an awful lot of time researching the wrong tree. And I had somebody try to combine my mother and the other Mary Jane Lawhorn, and yeah, my mother is still alive. She thinks it's hysterical. She didn't know the other lady. They were from different parts of the county. And as I said, I haven't found a connection, but there are enough similar names repeating in their trees that I'm a generation or two back from the link. So you do need to search for women under both maiden name and all married names, because records are created with the name the person uses at that time. So for the 21st century, here's a research plan. We're going to talk about first steps in records and documentation, and then we're going to talk about some first steps in DNA testing, and then we'll go to next steps. So document that paper trail. Look for vital records such as birth, marriage, divorce, and death. Obituaries can be really helpful if they exist, which is mostly a 20th century thing. Now that you have to pay an arm and a leg for an obituary in most papers, a lot of people aren't doing them, or they may only be at a funeral home site. So you may have to dig a little bit, and just because it's there online today does not mean it will be there online tomorrow. So if you find it, save it, print it, or save it to your computer. Federal and state census, local and family history books, online trees, and communication with other researchers. Note, a tree is not a source. The record is the source. And then family websites, local historical or genealogical society websites, and library and archive websites are really one of the first places to look. Online is, we've only had the World Wide Web roughly 28 years, something like that. But it has become very valuable for research and communication. And a lot of things are online digitally, but even more things will never be online digitally because nobody's willing to pay the cost of scanning and storing those records online. It's cheaper to have a piece of paper sitting in a book on a library shelf than it is to store something digitally when you're talking billions of records. So this is an example of a marriage record in 1943. This is my paternal grandparents. And you see that you get at the top their names. They ask for the maiden name. This is in Virginia. And then you get their age, race, whether they are single, widowed, or divorced, and how many times they've been married. So this can be a key place to look. Is this a first marriage, a second marriage, fourth marriage, etc.? It doesn't always mean they answered the question honestly, but it's a clue. I have seen a number of people who, through the years, particularly in the 20s and 30s, where their second marriage, they don't claim to have been married the first time, probably because they were not legally divorced at that point. If they were in South Carolina, divorce was not legal until the 1950s. So there were a lot of people who unofficially divorced, and some of them chose to lie and remarry. So some of them went to other states and got divorces and all of that. But sometimes you have to take single with a little bit of a grain of salt. But in this case, it says occupations of the people. So my grandfather was an engineer. She was a secretary. He was born in Marion, South Carolina. Technically, he was born in Dillon County, South Carolina, because he was born in Latta 4 years after Dillon County was created in 1910. She was born in Punkateague, Virginia, which is over on the Eastern Shore. It gives parents' names. Well, it gives one of the about 7 options for his dad's name that I have. So William F. Rouse, his mother was Carrie E. Allen, and it gives his address is at 23 Aview Avenue in Norfolk, Virginia. So it gives you some good information to take a look at Google Maps and see if that's still there. Unfortunately, it's not. But something to look at. It gives her parents as Otho S. Turner and Elizabeth D. Bennett, and an address of her sister at 149 East, I think it's Leicester, but it could be Leicester because we're Americans and we don't always use the British pronunciations, Avenue. That is actually under a highway interchange now. On Google Maps. So I've got pictures of the house from the 40s. And they proposed the marriage as of May 1st, 1943 in Norfolk, Virginia. This is the license part. And then the certificate at the bottom, J. Samuel Johnson, minister of the Baptist Church on the 1st of May, 1943 in Norfolk, did officiate the wedding. And this was returned to the clerk of court and filed in the books. In South Carolina, marriages are public record from the time they are actually filed, that return is filed. If the minister forgets to mail it back in, then it might not be registered and it might not be legal. So yeah, always do double check. So here is a death certificate from North Carolina in 1915. They ask a bunch of questions, but death certificates in particular are secondhand information. A marriage certificate, you physically have to apply for yourself and give your best faith answers to the questions that are asked. You may get parent name unknown. But death certificates, there is an informant who gives the information. In this case, this is my great-grandfather's death certificate. His son, R.A. Ronald, my great-grandfather, or my grandfather's brother, sorry, great-grandfather's brother, this is great-great-grandfather. Anyway, he died of tuberculosis in a sanitarium in Southern Pines, North Carolina. They were from Latta, South Carolina, which again is in Dillon County, historic Marion District, down near where I-95 crosses North Carolina into Virginia. So I could not find this death certificate for the longest time because I was insisting that he lived in South Carolina. He had to have died in South Carolina. Nearest tuberculosis sanatorium was in North Carolina. Especially counties like Spartanburg, where we are a border county, do check the neighboring state. Because sometimes you just miss something because you're not looking broadly enough. Now, if you're talking 5 states over, unless it was an accident, then may or may not be your person. It may be someone with the same name. So be careful. But you'll notice instead of WMF on the parent of my grandfather, it's just F. Rouse. That was the other problem. I was looking for his name, not his initial. He was a bookkeeper. He was 35 years old. Pulmonary tuberculosis was the cause of death. Educational attainments fair. Okay. Not sure why they were asking that question in 1915 in North Carolina, but you sometimes get fun information. And that he was born in Florence, South Carolina. So Florence County, again, in the PD, the lines kept moving. They moved around probably more than I realized. Name of his father, J.J. Rouse, from Darlington County, South Carolina. Louise Thornhill from Scotland. Now, I read Scotland the first time and thought it meant Scotland as in the UK, British Isles, Scotland. No, there's a Scotland County, North Carolina, that's a border county to Marion, Darlington, etc. I haven't found anything on Louise Thornhill there, but I have a new place to look. So if it doesn't have a state after the name, first assumption is state the certificate is from. So most of the time, they look at anything that is in the state and they don't add the state abbreviation. If it's out of state, they will add the state abbreviation. So your mileage may vary on this, but it's just a helpful tip that I learned just this year. And I've been doing genealogy for over 30 years now. And so, oops. I don't talk about mistakes you can make in genealogy unless I have made that mistake too. So we're all learning and we all are doing our best faith effort to do our genealogy and do it correctly. The bottom of the page, you do get the informant is R.A. Rouse from Cheraw, South Carolina. And then at the bottom right of this form, you do get that the intended place of burial is in Latta, South Carolina. And his grave is in Magnolia Cemetery there in Latta. So it helps you know information about the things. If it is an accident of some sort, workplace or other, there will be some additional information in most death certificates, because workers' comp, in the periods that it was a thing, that's one of those things that the lawyers get involved in. So sometimes you get really interesting things. I came across a death certificate just this past week where intoxicated and drowned in a puddle. Felt just right to just breathe enough water that he was gone. But anyway, the things you never knew you would learn about your extended family. So obituaries. Obituaries are a great resource, particularly, as I said earlier, for 20th century research. Again, I don't tell stories on other people. I tell stories on myself on when I forget to do things that I know better about. All three of these obits, I neglected to cite where I found them and what paper and date they were published. In fact, two of them on the right-hand side, I may have pulled from other people's trees and they didn't have that information either. And I had the thought, oh, I'll just find it and cite it later. And then, oops, I'm using them in a presentation and I'm not exactly sure where they were from. So it is very helpful for any of these documents that you find that you save the name of the source, the date it was published, if that's important. You know, a death certificate is going to be the date of the death, maybe a certificate number, the page of the newspaper, the location of the newspaper. Sometimes you can figure out a newspaper by the name of the paper. The one in the middle, Jeanette Chandler's obit, is from the Daily Press. There is a handwritten, very faint citation of the date and location up on the top of it, and I would have to go into that image and look at it much more carefully to find it out. But the one on the right and the one on the left, no. I have looked at the one on the left again. That is from the state newspaper. It was specialed from the Latta newspaper, which does not exist online. And so far, I haven't found extant copies of that paper. But if you were prominent enough in South Carolina and a few other states that have state newspapers that operate this way, the obituary may very well have appeared in that state newspaper. Helpful hint, if you've got Kansas, Kansas doesn't have a state newspaper. The Topeka newspapers do not collect or publish obituaries from outside of Topeka. And if you died at one of the hospitals there, you probably still don't have an obit in Topeka unless you were a resident of Topeka. So again, we had plenty of people call us from South Carolina expecting the state capital to have a state newspaper like that. It's just not how it works everywhere. So sometimes you have to figure out things on the ground in the location where you're looking. And different states will have different records and ways of keeping them. Different countries will have vastly different records and ways of keeping them. You may find that the woman is listed as Mrs. Alfred Shreves with no identity of her own other than the husband's. Fortunately, in the next sentence, first sentence of the obituary, Mrs. Emma Turner Shreves, 84. So even if the title doesn't have her name, maybe as you read through, you will find out more information about her and her parents. And the byline, this was published in the Onancock paper or was copied from the Onancock paper to another paper. Again, I forgot to cite my source. And so, but we at least know a location. It talks about her husband, it talks about children, and it talks about parents. Sometimes you're lucky enough, it says who is predeceased and who is still living, and that can be a blessing. Sometimes they even give grandchildren's last names, and you can tell if there's one boy and one girl that the people with the surname might be the boys' kids and the people with the other surnames might be the girls' kids, but you can't always bet on that. But it does help you sort things out a little bit. It gives locations for where children or siblings might be living. So you might have found the sibling who, it's say in New York. New York isn't where the family has ever been. Well, that kid moved to New York for their career, and they and their family are in New York. So you need to look in New York for their records. So it's clues, it's building the puzzle. You get information about funeral services and where burials may be happening or whether there was a burial. So it can help, again, tell you where to be looking. Don't take all information as correct without double checking. I do not have the example of this, but I can tell on myself. When my grandmother died in 2015, I was so worried about double checking that my mother had spelled all of my grandmother's siblings' names right, because there are a couple that are not your standard spelling. I missed the fact that my mother was a year off on her parents' marriage date. My mother and her sister almost came to a fist fight at the family visitation. I had to pull up my grandparents' marriage certificate on my phone and say, "Nope, Mom, we messed up." My mother was absolutely dead certain that her parents were married in 1939. They were married in 1940. She didn't come along till 43. There's no silly stuff going on. I knew that because Granddaddy died just short of their 50th wedding anniversary in 1990. I didn't catch that we had the wrong year. That's what got published in 5 newspapers. We didn't pay to do corrections. So things may be close. Family may sometimes forget family members in the obituary. I have seen brothers and sisters-in-laws written as siblings. And so some things can get weird. So take it as a good hint, a good pointer for who you should be looking for, and understand that sometimes things get a little wonky. And particularly if there are some adoptions or misattributed parentage events, not the parent expected. Sometimes by the time the obituary has been printed, things have come out and they have acknowledged these previously unacknowledged children. So, or they may just list people as children just because they were raised in the household, but they may not be biological children. So sometimes it can get a little messy. So, but it's a good source for further research. So, censuses. Federal censuses began 1790. Up until 1840, they were just listed by head of household with tick marks for the number of people in a given category. You can hear more about this in my upcoming program in November on census 1790 to 1890, and then I will follow up in December with 1900 to 1950. With the release of the 1950 census, I can no longer do all of our federal censuses in one program. That's part of my first Monday genealogy series. Our October one, just for promo purposes, will be bilingual Hispanic resources. Our Spanish language specialist here at the library and I will co-present that. It's going to be fun. But back to this. The federal census, starting in 1850, named all members of the household by name, age, gender, race, and then there were additional questions. 1850, 60, and 70, they did not ask for relationship of head to the head of household. So it's an implied family relationship in those years. Starting in 1880, we have head of household plus the relationship to them. And you will see lots of information. They ask occupation and that kind of thing. In the early centuries of our country and decades, they did not do gross domestic product and industry demographics as often as we do now. We get a report every month now because they have changed the way they track those statistics. But these were the early days of how many free men, free women, enslaved men, enslaved women, children, etc., were in the country. The primary use of the census is for representation in the House of Representatives. Every state gets 2 senators, but based on population, each state gets their proportion of the 435, 438, I haven't looked at that statistic in a while, the members of the House. In the early years, they just started with a certain number and they kept expanding, and then they ran out of space in the chamber and decided this is our top number. So if you participated in the 2020 census, and I hope you did, then that count gets used to determine whether South Carolina gains, loses, or stays the same in the number of House seats we have at the federal level. Most states, including South Carolina, also use the federal data to apportion the state House representative numbers. For many years, and in some states, they still do, there are state censuses done at a different time. South Carolina has a couple fragments that survive, but states like Kansas from 1855 until 1925 on the 5 years did a state census. Federal census is on the 0 years. So sometimes a state census can help fill in the blanks and help fill in those holes between censuses. Oh, look, they've already moved to Kansas by 1885. 1880, they're still in Ohio. So that can help. And in my program, I'll talk a whole lot more about the fiasco that destroyed the most of the 1890 census, but that's a story for another day. Do look, Ancestry is great about highlighting, hey, these are the people that you want. Do look before and after them on the same page, maybe before on the previous page, after on the next page, because you may be surprised at how many people you are related to lived in that little chunk, because they did go house by house by house by house by house. Now, somebody might not have been home, so they might have gotten enumerated or counted in a different location in the census. But a lot of the time you get everybody who lived on that street or everybody who had neighboring farms along that particular road. And that can be really helpful when you're like, oh, so that's how Aunt Laura met Max. The families had farms next door to each other. So on this particular page, it has most of the married siblings of my great-great-grandmother, my great-grandparents, and her siblings. So I'm related to about 2/3 of the people on this page at a very close level. They were related to each other very closely. So it can be helpful to just keep your eyes open, because it can also save you time in your search, because you can flag it as, oh, this census page has this person, this person, this person, this person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to look it up every time you're researching every one of those people. So, family history books have been the backbone of genealogical research for many years until the advent of the internet. Now, I will talk about online trees in just a second. Just because it makes it into print does not make it true, okay? Genealogists for many years have been doing the best they can, and they may not have been able to look at the same source documents that we now can see digitally online. They may have taken someone's transcript of a source document as correct. Every time there's a new generation of information, there is the chance that something's going to get mistyped, mistranscribed, etc. Very rarely is it intentional, although I will tell you, be very careful of family histories published between about 1890 and 1940. That is an era where a lot of people wanted to be in these newfangled lineage societies like the Daughters of the American Revolution, founded in 1890 or 91, something like that, in the 1890s. And some unscrupulous genealogists got paid to fabricate links to American patriots for these ladies and some of the men for other societies, Mayflower Society, etc., who wanted to be in these societies. So sometimes extra children got added into families. Those are the small percentage where it is actually malicious. These people were being paid to create something so that they could use it to get into this or claim relationship to kings, queens, and European royalty. Now, legitimately, many people in the United States, especially of colonial stock, do connect back to European royal lines. Just be careful that you actually look at the documentation. There are genealogists who will also claim lineages back to Adam and Eve, which is impossible because the records do not exist. So, always be skeptical, put your thinking cap on, and just make sure you understand what you're looking at. If you can find, and we've got a whole row of family history books on our shelf in the Kennedy room, and most of them are very good. A few of them are probably fiction, and some of them just have absolutely no sources. So you've got a name, a date, and a location, maybe, and you're going to have to go do some additional work to verify that they actually made the right conclusion. So, don't want to scare you on that, but I do want to just make sure you are aware. So in this particular slide, shoemaker families, well-researched, well-sourced. Kimberly and I are Facebook friends, and it turns out we're not genetically related because she did a DNA test and got a surprise. We should be related on both the shoemaker and the shoemaker sides. I have a shoemaker who married a shoemaker, and she also lineage through the family that raised her descends from that family. She did this was years of work. And then she got the DNA surprise. So it happens to all of us. So well-researched. And then the Sampson County Heritage Book, North Carolina particularly has these heritage books, and people submitted little family sketches for them, which are only as good as the information the person writing the sketch has. Again, they can be great clues. Some of them are fantastic. Some of them are really nice little stories. So, county histories are the same way. J.B.O. Landrum did some fantastic work with his history of Spartanburg County, circa 1900. But the rumors that you could slip them a little extra to make your family look a little better than it was are probably actually not just rumors. It was probably true. There are a lot of good stories in that book that there's no shred of evidence that those things happened. And when even he says there's no evidence of Kate Berry ever being called Kate, for one, she was Margaret or Peggy in every record, or that she did the heroic ride to warn her husband Andrew and Daniel Morgan, etc. Give me some sources, find me her diary. We would love to source that. But when J.B.O. Landrum on that says, a local legend is that Kate Berry did this. If he says it's a legend, it's a story. So, not discounting, she probably did something really cool. We got to prove it. So, and every one of her descendants is probably coming after me this week. But anyway, online trees are really fantastic. Again, this is the last 25 years or so. Family Search was doing computer-based trees prior to that. Once we had desktop computing by the late 70s, early 80s. Prior to that, people would fill in these family charts and mail them to Salt Lake City. So some of that has gotten into the global family search tree. This happens to be an example of one of my trees on Ancestry. Everybody in all of these pictures is deceased, which is why there are no redactions. I do subscribe to genealogical ethics that I do not talk about living people in a findable way, trackable way, unless I have their permission. As I said, I have my mother's permission. But it tells you information about the person. Note, Ancestry no longer lets you do fun backgrounds. So this is an older screenshot. But you list brothers and sisters. Let me tell you, it's a whole lot easier to find all of the information on my great uncle Jasper than it is my grandfather John, because there are a whole lot fewer Jaspers. When I put Jasper's information into Ancestry the other day, there were only about 25,000 hits. When I put in John Rouse with his information, there are something like 500,000 hits, because everybody named all of the various 6 or more Rouse families have a bajillion Johns. There are only a handful of Jaspers. So researching a sibling can sometimes be really, really helpful, and it can help you narrow down on the information you want and the correct family. Just know, unless it's an extremely unique name, you gotta just double check that you've got the right one. So, first steps for DNA testing. We are in the 21st century now. DNA testing is a thing. If you are scared of skeletons in the closet, don't want the black sheep stories coming out, don't test yourself. Just know somebody else is going to test. They're going to probably come out relatively soon anyway. But recommended first steps, if you are interested in autosomal DNA testing. Autosomal is the across-the-board DNA testing that's been on the market for a little over a decade. 2011-12 is when it came on the market. Ancestry.com is recommended. They have 28 million test results in their database. 23andMe only has a measly 11 million, something like that. MyHeritage, Living DNA, and Family Tree DNA are much smaller databases and will accept uploads from the other two. Ancestry and 23andMe, you have to directly test with them. Watch for sales. They always run a really good Black Friday sale. So if you're interested. Y-DNA, which is that straight male line, or mtDNA, which is mitochondrial, which is the straight maternal line, are usually less helpful to the beginner. They're much harder tests to interpret, and fewer people do them maybe 1 million tests combined. I mean, it's a whole lot smaller pool. But for certain questions, those can be the way to answer the question, but I wouldn't start with those. So next steps. So you found the birth, marriage, death census. You sent off your DNA test. It'll take a month or two to get the results back. What are the next steps you can be doing? Well, for records and documents, things like wills, probates, estate records, land records, military, letters, diaries, family papers, city directories, yearbooks, and court records. And we'll go through some examples of these. So, wills, probate and estate records. Hope you have brushed up on your handwriting analysis, because you do need to be able to read handwriting or bring along a friend who can. When we have teenagers come into the room wanting to look at some of these things, we recommend they bring a grandparent or a great-grandparent with them, because their parents and they have probably not been taught how to read handwriting. It is coming back into the curriculum because there are cognitive things that wire in our brain when you learn to do handwriting, and they have discovered this. But also, there has been a realization that if you can't read the handwritten record, you can't do a lot of jobs. If you're a clerk of court, you've got to be able to read handwriting, different things like that. Not just people who are librarians like me, but it's helpful. But these are largely oversized handwritten items. This is the Marion County, South Carolina estate packet number 31. I have ancestors that unfortunately their records were in the Georgetown records that got burned in the Civil War. And so I may never break down a couple of the brick walls that I've got. You may find information like what is on that central page, which is amounts paid out to the administrators and some of the beneficiaries and debtors of this estate. So when they announced, hey, the estate is open, these people put in their receipts for, well, I'm owed this much money. So you can start putting together relationships of people, not just the direct heirs. If there is an estate sale, you may get names and what was purchased by each of the neighbors, etc. And so it can be very interesting. Some of them are very not detailed, and some of them are very overly detailed. We have one, I was counting pages back when we charged 50 cents a page for somebody who wanted an estate file of somebody. They owned a half interest in a hotel, and the person doing the inventory started going, hotel room number 1, half interest in a soap dish, half interest in 2 bed sheets, half interest. They didn't get all of the hotel rooms done because apparently some of them were occupied. But what they could have done is X number of hotel rooms that had bed, whatever, added it up. So this many sheets or whatever. I guess they were being paid by the page or the room or something. So you never know what you're gonna find. Check for multiple pages, because some of these files, as I said, that one was about 125 pages of inventory of an estate. Some may just be a couple of pages saying, so-and-so died, these are the people appointed as administrators, and you may not get the rest of the paperwork, but you may get, there was not a significant enough personal property or real property to have probate actually happen. So, but you at least get something, and hey, you have a death for that person. Different states will organize this process in different ways, call it different names. It is through the probate judge here in Spartanburg County, equity court is another name. Pennsylvania, I believe they run it through orphans court, because originally they were dealing with the orphans that the dads left behind, because mothers couldn't be financial guardians of their children until well into the second half of the 1800s, if not into the 1900s. My great-grandmother had trouble and had to appoint a financial guardian for my grandfather and his siblings when their dad's dad died in 1918. So it's just one of those things that sometimes there are records created. You will also see in some states, a different name for the equity court is chancery court, which is an old English term. But chancery and equity court are kind of courts of second chances when probate sometimes goes sideways, or you have the youngest heir is an infant and from the third wife, and the oldest heirs are in their 20s and want to move out of state and want their inheritance now and not 21 years later when that infant gets to be 21. So it goes into equity court or into chancery court to be divided up equitably between the heirs, and something is done. If you want to challenge the probate while it's in process, it often goes through that other court. So again, take a look at what the process is in the state you're looking at and time period, because that will help you know where to look. Half of the battle is sometimes figuring out, where do I look for this information? Land records. Land records, again, are often handwritten. Again, check for multiple pages or multiple entries. Watch for women registering a dower relinquishment. South Carolina was the final state to do away with dower relinquishments in 1985. So, I have friends who moved here in the 70s, early 80s, having owned, sold, etc., with their spouses' property in other states. They moved here, went to sell they bought a house for in a couple years and, upsized or whatever, figured out what neighborhood they really wanted to live in. They were moving. And so dower relinquishment, the woman gets pulled into a separate room by an officer of the court, and they have to verify that their husband has their permission to sell the property, that they are not being coerced, and that they're okay with this. It was a holdover from we don't want the woman to be left impoverished when the man sold it and then took the money and ran, or drank all of the money that they got from selling her property or property. And we don't want her to end up in the county home. We don't want her to end up, and the children to end up, as burdens of the county. So we're going to put this check and balance in to make sure that it can't be done, because prior to the second half of the 1800s, women couldn't own real property except for in very limited circumstances. And if they were married, they didn't own, because marriage meant they were one with the spouse and they had very few legal rights. So look at the next entry or the entry after that just to see. I have a really weird one in the 1870s where 3 women are relinquishing dower rights in a particular property in Marion County, or Darlington, one of the two, that I can't figure out the connection between the 3 women other than somebody forgot to do the paperwork, and their version of the title company at that time was making them jump through all of the hoops to clear title on this property. So I don't know what's going on there. I, again, have to do more research, but they are all clearly relinquishing their dower rights in this. Dower rights tend to also be a third lifetime interest in the property for living there or for proceeds of the sale. so a third rights for their lifetime, but they could not then designate that third to who they want to. That third at their death goes, or remarriage goes to the other heirs. So again, slightly misguided attempt to protect the little lady, but it helps us because it creates records. Just like you want that guy who gets in a couple brushes with the law, because that creates records. So our lily white, very clean cut people don't always. One of the other things you may find in deed books, personal property exchanges pre-emancipation, including the enslaved, may appear in these deed books. Listing of enslaved persons will appear in estates in the probate record as to this enslaved person, name, value goes to this child, this one goes to this child or grandchild, etc. So it can be a shock the first time you deal with it, and the second, and the 15th. But we have to read the records of what was going on at the time, because it is the historical record. We can feel about it however we want to feel about it. We can be darn angry about it if we want to be darn angry about it. It's just a matter of, you will come across some things in these records that can challenge you. And in the United States, land records, probate estate records are going to be filed in the location the land or the property is, where the person was living. Sometimes you see them registered in both the current, where the property is, and if the person has moved out of state or some of the heirs are out of state, it may also be registered in their locality. And especially for property over in the Greer area, we see a lot of things that have been registered in both Greenville County Register of Deeds and Spartanburg County Register of Deeds, because one person of the process is on the Greenville side of the line and the other is on the Spartanburg County side of the line. So not always, but if you're not finding something that's in a border part of the territory, check the neighboring territory, because it may have gotten there. On rare occasions, we see people in the northern part of Spartanburg County, they were in town up in neighboring North Carolina rather than coming to Spartanburg, and something might have gotten registered. Now, also, the line between South Carolina and North Carolina keeps shifting. It has shifted once since I moved here, and I've only been here since June of 2014. So sometimes it's not they moved, the line moved. So again, if you're not finding it in the place you expect to find it, do check neighboring jurisdictions just to be careful. Military records. The top right is my great-grandfather's draft registration card for the old man's draft. And so it gives you a lot of information about where they were living at the time the draft was happening. His age, he was 48, so he was too old, but he had to register anyway. There were 4 or 5 drafts for World War II. So it was people who qualified at this point if they were 18, at this point if they were 18. Hey, if you're too old for those, we need to verify that you're too old to be drafted, and then an additional one later in the war for those who had become 18 again. But it will tell next of kin. So Mrs. W.A. Lawhorn, thanks. She had a name. She was Laura Susan Shoemaker Lawhorn. Lived in Cornwall, Virginia. In employer was South River Lumber Company. And so you get good stuff. Look on the back of the draft cards, because it will tell you height, weight, stature, stout, thin, dark complexion, ruddy complexion, yellow complexion, color of eyes, and often will have his, because only men were required to register, signature, as well as the signature of the person doing the draft registration. And if that happens to be your ancestor, you found out about a really cool fact that they were literate enough to be a clerk for the draft board. And I didn't copy the back of this one for this particular slide, just to tell you that it's there. This is actually a registration, Army Register of Enlistments, and it's from the 1830s. One of my ancestors, my third great grandfather, George Scott, per his obituary in 1902, which explains a lot, it says, as a young man, he took off to Canada to experience snow because he read about it and was curious. On his way back south, he decided in New York State to enlist in the Army to go help Andrew Jackson with the Indian removals of the 1840-ish, late 1830s, and was sent with Andrew Jackson to Florida. And so you get this great listing, but it does specifically say in this, George W. Scott of Accomack County, Virginia. And I'm like, why was he enlisting in New York? His obituary tells the rest of that story. I recently paid a researcher to grab his military files. What we discovered was, while he did get a pension for serving in the Indian Wars, he got it before there was an actual pension act for that war, which means he had a personal act of Congress and the Senate to actually get that pension. And I now have copies of those transcripts of those acts. And so it was a very cool thing to find out. It would have taken me a lot longer than it took that researcher who specializes in military research to find that document. But it explained more of the story of who this guy is. I actually have a photograph of him in about 1901 in a family photograph on the front porch, which I think is later in this. Just one note about military records. Military records are considered private to the service person, their immediate next of kin, for 62 years after final separation from the military. So if they went in the end of World War II, but then stayed in through Vietnam or continued in the reserve or the National Guard after their active military, it is final separation from whatever the last day they served officially the country. So some World War II records are requestable by anybody. Others are still restricted because it hasn't been 62 years since they left the military. I have a lovely friend who was responsible for shutting down Forbes Field in Topeka, career Air Force, who he went in at the end of World War II, did not retire from the Air Force until 1979, something like that, when they were shuttering that base at the very end. So his record is closed for a good chunk more. So don't expect everything to be online. Fold 3 does have some military stuff on there for 20th century. Service records are not on there yet for 20th century. There was also a 1973 Record Center fire in St. Louis that affected Army and Army Air Corps records. And if you are involved in that, or the person you're looking for is involved in that, just see me. There are ways to request. In the 50 years since that fire, they have recovered a whole lot of those documents, or they have reconstructed them from additional sources, such as registers like this. So doesn't hurt to ask the St. Louis Personnel Records Office. The answer may be, yep, we don't have much. Here's his DD 214. But you don't know until you ask, because I've also seen files where somebody's their record was over at the VA office being checked for something. So the record is in the quote, it was destroyed part of the collection. And it wasn't, because it was on somebody's desk. And they've found it in the last 50 years. And so sometimes you get lucky. So you may find letters, diaries, and family papers. These can be helpful, or they can just fill in some fun information and give you a sense for what your ancestor might have been like. This is the diary of my great-grandmother, Alan Rouse's sister. January of 1938, have decided to keep a diary for the first time in my 65 years of life. So it doesn't share anything about when they lived together or that kind of thing, but I know a little bit about when her immediate family was coming into town and visiting. As you leaf through, it's not a huge book. She didn't write in it every day, but it's a snapshot of what family life was like for that family. And it was just fun to hold it. My great-grandmother kept herself too busy to write and leave a diary. I have a lot of unlabeled photos. City directories. The location needed to be large enough to have a city directory, but not so large that a book was not feasible. So cities like New York were early adopters in the 1820s and 30s of city directories, but by the turn of the 1900s, they had to divide into, oh, you only get the Brooklyn or the Staten Island or the Long Island or the whoever. And even then, by a little bit further into the 20th century, they were too big to bind, and no one was going to pay the cost of that much paper for these kinds of directories. Spartanburg, we have our first city directory is 1880, 82, something like that. And it is a combination with Greenville. We have the most complete run of city directories for Spartanburg. Ancestry has a handful. We are getting our collection digitized, and it is what we have digitized so far is on our historical digital collections. So take a look at that city directory collection. It is not transcribed. So you do have to go to the year and then flip the pages and find the alphabetized listing and that kind of thing. And starting in about the 20s, there are street listings. So if you know the address and you want to look up who was living at the address, you can do that. But these can be really helpful because they usually say person's name or man's name, head of household, spouse name in parentheses. Sometimes you get widow of in parentheses, the address they lived at, and often the employer they worked for. Sometimes you get the phone number in that listing too once we get into that era. Telephones started to be more widely used in the 1920s. So you can research businesses, community organizations, churches, etc. They had yellow pages, just like the phone books, and so which were business listings and advertisements. This happens to be one from 1899 from Macon, Georgia. That Louise Thornhill on that death certificate, it's her stepbrother, who's a grocer in Macon, Georgia at this time, JLB Kelly. Anyway, yearbooks. Yearbooks can be a great source of 20th century information. Hate to break it to all of us, 20th century is history. We're 23 years into the 21st century. Yeah, my yearbooks are starting to pop up. It was the reminder that I'm getting old. You start getting photo yearbooks around the 1920s to 30s, maybe the 40s, depending on the location, depending on how well funded the location was. Sometimes you only get individual pictures of the seniors and maybe class pictures of the other groups and just text listings of various people. My grandmother's, my mom's yearbook had no pictures at all. It was only text. They graduated with 18 people in her class. So, small school in 1939, I think, something of that nature. So, it's just one of those things. Your mileage will vary as to what was published, but it's worth looking for those early and mid and late 20th century people. This happens to be my great aunt's husband, Louis Akehurst, there on the top left. And then you sometimes get these group shots of the yearbook staff or the whoever. So in Topeka, our favorite game was spotting the kids who wanted to know what their grandparents did in high school and found out, they didn't tell me he played trombone. So it can be fun and a good trip through memory lane. We do have a yearbook collection. Our yearbooks are typically located at the branch closest to where the school was, just because people are not necessarily going to drive from Landrum to here to headquarters to browse the yearbooks for Landrum High or Chapman, whichever one that is. Anyway, Woodruff has the Woodruff yearbooks. We are working to scan our older yearbook collections to again get that digitally available online. Ancestry has a whole bunch of them, but we've got more of Spartanburg County. So keep an eye out for that. So some of the next steps for DNA testing. So you did your test, you sent it off to Ancestry, 23andMe. You're getting the results. So look at your closest matches. Can you identify who they are? Maybe, maybe not. Did they use a nickname so that you can't tell who they are? Are they my mother, who, even though I told her to use her maiden name, used her married name and confused the world? You know, it's just one of those things. You do what you can. You start grouping your matches into family lines by seeing who also matches them. And the amount of centimorgans, which is the unit of measurement for DNA, you share about 3,500 centimorgans with a parent-child match. That's half of your centimorgans. You've got 7,000 of them, but you get 50% from dad, 50% from mom. And so they look at which 50%. And the categories are just buckets. Other than parent, child, and full sibling, it's gonna say close family first cousin. And it could be a niece, nephew, it could be a first cousin, it could be an aunt or uncle. It's a grouping. So look at that match, see if you can figure out where they fit in your family tree. And then DNApainter.com is a great resource. It is free. There are some paid tools there, but the shared centimorgan tool is your friend. Ancestry has gotten better about when you click in, it will tell you, hey, it's 75% chance it's these relationships. This gives you a visual way. So if you type something into the little box in the middle there, it will light up whichever of the options in the bottom will be more likely or possible. So it gives you some targets to look at to say, oh, okay, I should be looking in the second cousin range. Do I have all of my second cousins in my tree on this side of the family? And on my mother's side, I can categorically say I don't, because my mother on her mom's side was one of 29 first cousins, 27 who made it to adulthood. And I think every single one of them had at least a child, if not multiple. So the initial count I had was about 56 in my generation. And so it's just one of those things where you start putting the pieces together and playing around with what you have. If you do have additional questions about the DNA stuff, I'm happy to do one-on-ones with people. I also have programs on our YouTube playlist that talk more specifically about looking at your DNA test results. So you need to evaluate what you discover. Be skeptical. Does the information make sense? Found a family search sent me a little thing. Hey, you've got a famous relative. You're related to Pocahontas. According to them, she's my 12th grade aunt through her sister. Yeah, they have her in there as a princess too. As I said, princesses are European nomenclature. She was a chieftain's daughter. We don't know that we can prove this. And I was like, oh yeah, well, I know through her cousin on the Bass line. Yeah, I hadn't connected that part in the family search tree. They were trying to connect me through a line that I can't prove the parents. And you look 2 generations up from where I can't prove yet, and they've got a grandparent who was born after the grandchild. So let me tell you, biologically impossible. That's not even just a records, an 8 and a 3 got misread. That's just somebody blatantly wrong in that online tree. So again, evaluate what you're looking at. Think about your sources. Is this a good source? Can I verify the information that is in it? Is it a government document that things really are matching up with what I think should be there? Are there some red flags? What is a bad source? Is it one of these family trees where you got dates that just do not line up? Or is it one of these 1920s family histories that seem a little suspicious because, sorry, we have noise outside the room. A little bit suspicious because everything's going back to royalty and you might not be able to verify. Typically, royalty are very easy to verify because the peerages in Europe have tracked those. So you should be able to, if you're looking at a particular royal, you should be able to go to British or German or whichever country they are, resources, and check what the heralds in those countries, or whatever that country calls it, Britain, it's heraldry, what they have proven and say is the verified lineage. No. Could they be wrong on somebody who wasn't a legitimate child? Yes. But I dare say there were not nearly as many illegitimate children of royals as have been claimed. So again, think it through. It's kind of fun to be able to say, hey, well, my whatever cousin was Pocahontas or George Washington or whoever. And if you have colonial Virginia roots, colonial, any of the colonies roots, you're probably related to most of the presidents. Just saying, because you go back far enough and everybody starts being related. It's going to be a 13th cousin twice removed or something. But again, you got to check the lineage between you and them. Is there possible that there's someone with the same name, same place, same time period? To Mary Jane Lawhorns, born in 1943, Rockbridge County, Virginia. Could this person have a child of the age given or known? They're not having children at 8. Again, biologically impossible. Now, is the date maybe wrong because prior to Social Security coming in 1936, a lot of people didn't care how old they were, and years got added or subtracted on the whim, or they forgot to add a year or 2 along the way? Or in the case of women, they couldn't be older than their husband, thank you very much. So mysteriously, 8 years disappeared after that 3rd marriage. It just depends. Do the dates, locations, and relationships logically work out with what you know? And again, there are sometimes when something looks really funny, like in my naturalization program, I have an example where the family was back and forth from the Slovak Republic, I think, one of those, to New York. He was a merchant, and one of the children was legit born back in the old country while they were visiting. And when she naturalized later in the 1930s, she had to naturalize that children, but she listed all of the children, the ones that immigrated with them initially were born in the US, that child and the younger ones born back in the US. So sometimes there is a legit explanation. So sometimes you just have to go, this doesn't make a lot of sense. I need to do more research. And make a note and come back to it. In the case of censuses, the relationship to the head of household tells you person, spouse, children. If those older children are close in age, or the woman listed as wife is only a few years or 10 years older than those first children, she's probably not their mother. But it doesn't say the spouse's relationship to the rest of the household. It's the head of household's relationship to the rest of the household. So if ages aren't lining up quite right, it could be a second or third spouse, not the mother of part of those children. So trying to figure out when people remarried fairly quickly and had very large families, who was the mama, can sometimes be a little bit of sort, oops, missed that, resort, check, granddaddy's will on all of the potential mom sides and those types of things. So it gets fun. So family stories, material history, interview your older family members. Some of us have become the older family members. I mean, technically my brother is 2 years older than me. He's the older family member on my dad's side of the family, but we're it. We are the living generation. My father was an only grandchild. All of his parents died when he was a child. His grandparents either died well before he was a child or when he was a child. There's nobody left to ask until you get to second and third cousins' descendants. So I'm doing a lot blind, but if there are older family members, ask. Also look at what some of the things you have inherited from your family, because they can tell some stories about your family that you might have to put some pieces together, but can be really fun. So family stories, the gentleman who went off to Canada to see snow is the older gentleman on the right-hand side of that middle row, very stately looking gentleman. That my father, in his identification of the people in this, was just her father, Scott. His daughter, Georgiana Warrington Scott Bennett, is there in the center. My great-great-grandmother. My great-grandmother is in the back row holding my grandmother's oldest sister. We're fairly certain this photo was taken in 1901. If it is indeed Annetta and not the older sibling that nobody remembers, but I have a birth record for in 1898. But Annetta was born in 1901 in May, and George Scott passed away in November of 1902. So we have a 1.5 year window. But interview those older family members, ask about their lives, not just about the common ancestors. Open-ended questions about topics of interest can be good. Be willing to let them go in a different direction. You may learn something cool and different that you didn't know to ask about. And also remember that some people have better recall of details than others. I know to expect zero truth out of almost everything my grandmother ever said. My grandmother was swayed by the last thing she heard or the last thing that was on 2020 or whatever the illness du jour was. And so if you listened to her, we had rampant all sorts of health problems, none of which play out genetically or in real life. She wanted to have those health problems, but she died at 94, fairly healthy. I have more arthritis in my joints right now than she had at 94, okay? But she wanted to be an invalid. So And the kicker on this was, and I wish I had done more interviews of her brothers and sisters when they were alive. All of that generation is deceased now. When 4 other people tell the story one way and grandma tells it a completely different way, it's likely that she's got the story wrong. She's made something up. So it's just one of those things. Evaluate what people are telling you. Don't tell them that they're lying to you, mind you. Be polite, but also know that some things may need more verification than others. Do record it if possible. They're little, on your phone, you may have an app, or there are also little digital recorders that you might be able to use. And then material history. Depending on who you ask, this is either my great-grandmother, Charity Caroline Johnson, or her sister, Mirandy, playing the squeeze box. Theoretically, that's supposed to be the squeeze box that is in my possession. I've compared the two pretty closely, and I'm not sure it's the one that I have, but it doesn't mean it wasn't one she had prior to this one. The one I have was ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog around the turn 1905-ish. So just given the model number and stuff. But did my great-grandmother and her sister play the accordion? Yes. Did they sing? Yes. Are they somehow related to the Johnson family singers who were on the radio in Charlotte for many years? Yes. So I'm still working on the exact connection, but music was important. The quilt that is behind her, the oldest child received it, and her oldest child, second oldest child, the one who was interested in family history, had, and it is now passed to her daughter, or granddaughter. And so, but we have a picture of that quilt. So that can tell you some things. The materials in that quilt are a step up from the absolute cheapest materials. It's not a feed sack quilt. It's got silks. It's got nicer fabrics. They took the time to do the embroidery. So there are things where they had enough leisure to work on this kind of project. If you have quilts, china, dishes, jewelry, furniture that the ancestor either owned or made, books, art, musical instruments, toys, etc., can help you tell the story of what was life like for these people. Now, they probably didn't have more than that one toy, and it may have been one toy that was passed through all of the children, doll, truck, etc. But depending on the economic status of the family, you may have inherited a couple of things, and that tells its own story. Were they the creator of the item, like this quilt? Was it purchased, like the accordion? Do you know anything about where it was purchased? I was going through some of my grandmother's things. My grandmother, bless her, saved every single greeting card she ever received in her life, which I, as the family archivist, inherited. I had dental card postcards from the 1980s that have now been thrown away, recycled. But those types of things do tell us about what their life was. I have not kept all of those greeting cards. I don't have space for that. I'm the only one halfway interested in my family, and I don't have kids. So I got to figure out who's inheriting what I choose to keep. But it is interesting to see that. I do have a set of cards that have my signature from exceedingly young, couldn't really hold the pen and it was a scribble, up to what is recognizable, my signature. So, keeping a few things. Can you document which family or family member the item was from? We have one Christmas card from my great-grandfather, the 1 year, and I believe it was in the 1970s before he died. May have been 1969, but it was early 1970s. On the envelope, it is written, "The only year Papa sent a Christmas card." So I have his signature on that, and I have documentation that that was the one. No, it's not a Christmas card that was fancier really to write home about, but because it was the one he sent, only one he sent, that made it a little bit more important. Especially for women, it can help document some of the gaps. What jewelry did they own? Do you have pictures of them with the jewelry on? Those types of things can really help tell a little bit more about their story. So, record keeping. Track what you discover. Paper files and digital files are our two big options for how you keep up with your stuff. So, we'll talk about the physical, we'll talk about the digital. Physical stuff. You can go older school, have file folders with the person or the couple or the family unit. You can do a pedigree chart. I'll show you an example of that. Family unit chart. A research log can help you track what you've done, and a correspondence log when you wrote off for something. So a pedigree chart is literally just the list of you to parents, to parents, to parents, to parents. The paper ones, and there is one in your handout, I think it's the last page of the handout, will tell you, it just helps you organize where do you have holes? Where do you have information? Where do you not have information? Do you not have a marriage date or location? Or do you not have a death location for someone and it's more than a century old? And you move back and forth on this. You start with yourself on pedigree chart 1, and so that you don't end up with a wall chart that you can't carry around. Once you get to the 4th generation here, it says continued on chart number whatever, and you just move back and forth from the charts on each family line. It's easier to carry around a file folder than it is to carry around the wall chart and unfold and stuff. So a family unit chart looks at that basic family unit, dad, mom, and the children. There are only 6 children on our form. You can always write on the back or just get an additional chart and just keep writing the children. Yes, I know that some families have more than 6 children. Plenty of those in my own family. It gives you a chance to write some different things, such as, oh, I know that this great-grandfather was married multiple times. Here are the other wife's names. So you may want to do a family unit chart that has him, first wife, their children, another chart that has second wife, their children, etc. Or if you know that there weren't any children for a particular relationship, you can just note it on the first chart and just say no children of this whatever, this relationship. You can note down military service, church membership, etc., as your kind of shorthand overview of what this family is. A research log or record, many forms available. I don't have a form in your packet. I have tried any number of ways on this. An Excel sheet has worked somewhat the best. My biggest problem is I don't consistently research on the same device. A research log is much easier to do if you are consistent about where you are researching or that you keep it in the cloud. So an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc that you can log into from if you're here at the library researching or if you're at home researching and update in real time. There are people who use iPads and do their research log on the iPad and then they're researching on a computer. You can find what works for you. This is best practices. I can't say that I can keep up with best practices on this. I'm not that organized. I try. But the helpful thing is, particularly if you are at a brick wall, track what have you looked at so you don't look at the same resource 5 different times, hoping there's going to be a different answer when it's a printed book that hasn't changed since 1956. Now, sometimes you miss something in it the first time, but if you keep going back to you're just wasting your time. You've got a lot of ancestors in your tree, you might not want to waste the time. If you're online particularly, are you looking at Ancestry? What search terms? What dates did you use? Sometimes if you have a birth date that has fluctuated, if you put a different birth date in, it might be Open Sesame. So sometimes remembering what got you the good result will be helpful. And what did you find? When did you do the search? I have done this one more consistently. Correspondence log. When did you write off to that repository to get those obituaries? Who was it? It was an individual that you wrote off to? Was it a library, the Bibb County Public Library Local History Room? How did you do it? Was it a mail-in, phone, email, internet message board? Those are going away, but anyway. Contact information that you used, because sometimes you contact that person or that organization and say, I haven't heard anything. And they said, well, we didn't get it. Where'd you send it? And you find out you sent it to the wrong address. So it can help. The date that you sent it, and then what did you receive? Did you hear back from them? Did they tell you no obituaries exist? Did they send you 3 obituaries? What information did you receive? We have people who have written us for obituaries and call us a day later from when they put it in the mail at their house 5 states over. Why haven't I gotten my obituary? We haven't received your request yet because it takes at least 4 or 5 days, and then it takes a day to make it from downstairs to upstairs here in the building. We ask for people to give us 2 weeks. Don't hound us after 24 hours. It's just one of those things. And we're small, we don't get that many requests, but if you're writing off to a state archive, it's likely going to be a 6 or 8 week lag. And let me tell you, you'll forget what you asked for by the time they contact you for clarification. So correspondence log can be helpful. Digitally, you can use online subscriptions like Ancestry. You can use the family search tree. Just know that on the family search tree, it is anybody who has a deceased profile, anyone else who has an account can edit that. So I wouldn't use that as a primary for specific things if you want to keep specific photos and things. Just my user feedback on that one. I use Family Tree Maker, which is the picture here. And it allows you to develop a research plan if you want to. It allows you to do reports, which I find helpful. I can print out different types of reports, and it will sync directly with my Ancestry tree, because I do not research on the same computer ever. Because sometimes I'm on this guy, sometimes I'm on my one on my desk. Sometimes I'm one on the staff desk. Sometimes I'm on one of the patron computers. Sometimes on my personal laptop at home. I use the online trees at Ancestry as my major research tree, but I download it regularly to my Family Tree Maker with all of the source documents so that I have a copy. If for some reason my renewal didn't go through on Ancestry, my credit card declined the transaction or whatever, that I don't lose access to my tree. Different people have different comfort level with keeping things in the cloud, like at Ancestry. So it's just one option. MyHeritage has trees that you can use, WikiTree. There are any number of online trees, some of which are collaborative trees, some of which you can control. So Family Tree Maker is the one I use. It's just the one that has always synced with Ancestry, so that's what I've used. Roots Magic is another one. Legacy is another one. Those are probably the top 3. Digital file folders organized by type of record. I have to admit, now that I am not using Ancestry Library Edition at the library and I have my own personal subscription to Ancestry, I've gotten lazy about saving all of the documents to a flash drive or my computer as routinely. I tend to save it to my tree and let the tree download it for me. But it can be helpful if I'm looking for an example of a 1860 census. 1960 won't be out for another decade. Then I can go to these files and pull an example of what I'm looking for. Or if you're trying to figure out, do I have censuses for all of the 0 years that this ancestor was alive, then it can be helpful. I also have a blank census template that I've downloaded from Ancestry. Family Search and Ancestry and any number of places have these, because sometimes on the census page, you can't read all the little handwriting. It's a bad copy of that on the scan. You can get, these are the questions that were asked, so you know what the question answer was. So those can be helpful. Random items sometimes get saved into the wrong folder. And so sometimes you have to do some file cleaning to clean things out. So we are at questions. And I see there's one thing in chat, which is probably the handout. Yes. So.
Hi, Charity.
Hi, Cheryl.
So far, no questions have been typed up, but I just wanted to reiterate about the family tree charts. We have plenty of those in the room, and when people come in and are just starting out, that's the first thing we usually do for any of them, because it's a place to keep all the information so you can refer back to it to make sure that whatever you're moving on to, you're still looking at the same family. That's probably researchers' biggest hindrance, I guess, is they want to just either print out something or just write it down in a notebook, and then they don't have a cohesive, this, I've found this information from, that helps carry on. So I was just going to say, it's really important to get a chart and use the chart.
Yep. And yeah, as Cheryl said, one of the things we do when somebody comes in and says, how do I get started in the room, is we hand them this how to begin little 2-page handout that's part of your larger handout. You also have a list of some basic genealogy terms that you will see used, because we use terms like grantor, the person who sells property, grantee, the person who buys property. And until you know what those mean, it's like, what did you just say? So you've got a list of vocabulary basics, and then the basics handout. We do update all of these periodically because things do change in genealogy land. The process of what you're looking for overall doesn't change, but where you're looking for it will. So we have in our collection, if you have someone who died in South Carolina between 1915, when they started keeping death records in South Carolina, to 1972, those death certificates are on microfilm in a drawer just over here, and you can look them up on our microfilm machines. Ancestry has them, but I think still only has up to 1969. It's a 50-year rolling release for privacy reasons. Birth certificates in South Carolina, again, they started keeping them in 1915. My grandfather doesn't have one because he was born in 1914. But that's a 100-year release. And so they are releasing those only on the Department of Archives and History website. If you are next of kin, you can pay I think that's up to $15 a certificate now from DHEC for those that are in the privacy restriction. Be prepared to send in your information to prove that you are next of kin. To get my grandmother's birth certificate in Virginia before she was, hers would have been 100 years, I had to send in my birth certificate that mentioned my father, his birth certificate that connected that generation, And I had to do a statement and technically they wanted me to send in certificates for all of them. And I was like, all but one of these people died in Virginia. I'm not sending you your own records. But I had to prove her parents, spouse, sibling, children were all deceased, that I, as a grandchild, would be the living next of kin. And for grins and giggles, I threw in the fact that my brother was fine with me requesting this information. In the process of all of, and with names and dates and locations of their deaths. Now, Great Uncle Edward is a problem because he died in Georgia. Georgia restricts death information or death certificates for 75 years. I'm not going to live long enough to get his death certificate, but I had to put in, he died this date, this location in Georgia. And I worked really, really, really hard for that $12 certificate. And I forgot to say copy of original handwritten. They sent me a printed from the computer like it was a current one. Now, it will function for what I need it to do. But now that it's more than 100 years old, I'm just waiting for it to come up on Ancestry, because Virginia partnered with Ancestry for all of their vital record releases. And they're indexed up through 2014. Which puts a lot of information out there. But some US states, Virginia is a 25-year restriction on death, South Carolina is 50, Georgia is 75, North Carolina, I don't think restricts it. So once it's been filed and it's there, it's public. It may not be online, but it's public. So it's gonna depend location to location what you're looking for and what it is. So that will be interesting. Marriages, Spartanburg County marriages, you have to go see the folks at the probate court office. They will not allow us so far to scan, digitize, release anything, even the oldest. We keep working on it. We do have an agreement with the Register of Deeds office. We're going to start digitizing the early deed books. We can't wait to get that project started. We do have those early ones on microfilm, but that's a black and white. It's not it's not color, and these will be full color and hopefully a little bit more readable than some of the microfilm ones that lost a lot when contrast isn't there.
Charity.
Yeah.
I was just going to say before we sign off, have you mentioned Newsbank that we have, just in case a lot of people are looking in Spartanburg County for things like obituaries and wedding announcements, things like that?
No, I forgot to do that on my obituary page. Thank you. So we now have, as of July of last year, so we've had it just over a year, Newsbank Historical Herald Journal collection that covers digitized copies of the Spartanburg Herald, the Spartanburg, the Carolina Spartan, and the Spartanburg Journal, and then post 1982 the Spartanburg Herald Journal combo from 1906 to 1998. That's the historical one, and then a current one that runs from 1988 to usually yesterday. And so you can see full image of most of those years. The 1980s are a little iffy, and like the 1998 through 2008 are a little iffy. A lot of those are transcript only still, but we're working on it. But if you're looking for obituary, if you're looking for a news article, if you're looking for a marriage announcement, birth announcement, that kind of thing in our local papers from 1906 to current, you should be able to go to one of those two collections, type in the name. I usually do names in quotes, first and last name together in quotes, because otherwise you get a lot of interesting things sometimes and you don't need to wade through that much. And you can see all of the various things. You can do that from home with your library card. It's in our learning tools list. Click the little news subject, and then it's right there. And so it's handy. You can do that at 2 a.m.
In your jammies.
In your jammies, if you have insomnia.
Okay, one last question then is, I sent it to your Kennedy Room chat.
Yes. Cool. Thank you. Let's see. She has heard that when adding a name to your ancestry.com family tree, you shouldn't use special characters. That would include no parentheses, no quotes, no period after a middle initial, for example. Yeah, typically the AI is smart, but not insanely smart. So if you have a nickname in quotes, it can cause more confusion than it helps. In the first, middle, and last name. Suffix field, the AI doesn't bother with the suffix field. So if you want to put senior, junior, the third, or some other code in the suffix field, that is up to you. But yeah, the search algorithm does get a little wonky if you do a lot of parentheses or quotes in the name fields. I've never heard the periods after like a middle initial or something, but it wouldn't surprise me. So what I usually end up doing when I'm searching for someone on my ancestry page versus just clicking the hints and seeing what Ancestry came up with, I click search on Ancestry from the profile page or fill in the information from my tree. And then I will go to the little edit the search in the top left. And sometimes I will add or take out information, particularly if I'm just looking for information about a second spouse, not the first spouse, that kind of thing. I will try to target the information to try to help the computer get the right information instead of stuff from England when they never left the United States. That's been the recent one. Ancestry has been having some problems in the last couple of weeks. They changed something on the back end, some update. Didn't quite work as anticipated. Somebody coded something a little wrong. And so I'm getting a lot of things from Australia when nothing even remotely. I've got records of them in the US, but yet they're trying to give me voter registration lists from Australia for somebody with the same name, same dates, but it's obviously not them because I can prove they were in the US at that time, or they weren't old enough to vote. That's always a fun one. So I always click the why did I ignore this hint? I click the little reasons and go about my business. So, you know, the computers are great. It has insanely sped up the pace we can do genealogy research. It's just a matter of the computer's only as smart as the people who program it. And most of the people who program it aren't genealogists. And they think they know better what we want than what we actually want. And so explaining to someone exactly how we need things to come out of the query, sometimes they don't get it and they don't listen because, again, they think they know better. And then it makes our lives harder. But it's better than ever before in our history. Because, you know, when I started doing genealogy, I did not have a library that I could have microfilm interlibrary loaned to like we do now. And so if I wanted to get some of these obituaries, I literally had to pack up on a family vacation and convince the family that they could drop me off at the library for an hour or two and let me look up obituaries from the microfilm or in the paper files, if they would let a teenager in their room. And that my family was okay with doing that. And sometimes having one cemetery vacation limit is a little frustrating, but I try to keep the peace. Sometimes I sneak off to a cemetery visit when they don't know I've snuck off. Oh, I just went for breakfast. Yeah, I snacked and visited relatives. So some people who aren't genealogists may not be as into it as the rest of us, but I like knowing who the people in my family are. I like solving those puzzles. I like answering those questions. It's part of what I do now on a daily basis. So I hope you learned something. If you've got more questions, feel free to come over to the Kennedy room, ask us. The whole team can help. If you stump them, they'll send you on up to me or to one of the other staff members that has expertise in certain areas. So thanks for being here, and I hope to see people on the first Monday class on Monday, October the 2nd. If you have any interest in Hispanic research or just want to hear about how those double names work, that's been fascinating to me to learn. So thanks so much.
All right. All right. I'm going to stop recording. Okay.
Yep.